the symposium a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
And Phil's, the on-demand transit services that they've got going in Longmont now, like he better get here for that question, because I was like, I read that and I'm like, okay, he just.
Yeah, I'm hoping he'll talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, he just did a great presentation on that topic.
Yeah.
He's the man. Yeah. Been doing it for a little longer with their program, and they're starting to buy more vehicles, but it's been the on-demand transit's really interesting.
Okay, 6:03. We'll get started. Welcome everyone to the 2025 Comprehensive and Transportation Plan Update Speaker Series. The purpose of this event is to share general information about transportation and land use planning in order to kind of prime the conversation for the Comprehensive Plan and Transportation Plan Town Hall, which will be happening next week on May 29th. Although, we might talk a little bit about specifics of the town, and examples and context, we're not really here to address any particular grievances or the plans themselves. This is more of a general conversation about transportation and land use and how it works. I do invite everyone to attend the open house next week, 1 week from today, Thursday, May the 29th, 5 to 7 at the community center in the south side of town. So we'll start by just having panelists introduce themselves. I don't know who wants to start. Maybe start over here with Steve.
So Steve Tuttle with the Fox Tuttle Transportation Group, traffic engineer, been working in and around Superior area, Boulder County, and Denver for the last 30 years. So do a lot of work working with towns and cities and counties on a consulting side and doing things like this, but also we do work with some development projects and larger development projects. So we have a lot of experience from both the development side and the agency side.
Alex Bullen, Public Works and Utilities Program Supervisor for the town of Superior. I've been with the town for 10 years now, and I've been leading some of the latest transportation planning efforts, as well as some of the traffic signal upgrades that you see around town.
Good evening, everybody. Bill Cowan. I'm also with the Fox Tuttle Transportation Group. I've been with the group for about 4 years. Before that, I had a wonderful 27-year career with the city of Boulder, where I had a myriad of different roles.
Okay, thank you. We'll also be expecting Phil Greenwald, who is coming down from the city of Longmont. He's also on the board at Commuting Solutions, which is like a local transportation, sort of a regional transportation organization. But we'll get started. One of the questions right off the bat was for Phil, so this one I'll direct at Steve, and then whoever wants to jump in, if you guys have other ideas, that's fine too. This one concerns that kind of the nexus of transportation and land use, and the question is, what are the traffic impacts of different land uses, and how is growth related to what we call congestion, and what kinds of transportation improvements typically accompany development to try to resolve some of those issues that arise from development.
Yeah, I can jump in on that first part. So what are the different traffic impacts of different land uses? We tend to break it into categories: residential, commercial, office, retail, services, institutional, things like schools, industrial, and they all kind of generate different levels of traffic per acre, per square foot. So we can compare them that way, but they also generate traffic differently. So for instance, residential traffic and office traffic is fairly predictable. You've got commuting patterns, especially office commuting patterns in and out in the morning. Retail traffic is generally going to generate, and retail centers are generally more midday, evening, and weekends. Typically your residential uses on a square foot basis are probably don't generate as much traffic as, say, a restaurant does on a square foot basis. But we also have to look at the different characteristics of the traffic. Retail traffic, is probably the highest generator per square foot. So we think of congestion in our minds, we think of like retail areas. And that's for two reasons. One, it's generating a lot of traffic locally, but there's a lot of access associated with these types of developments. And so when you think of, or I think of retail and I think of congestion, I think of like Colorado Boulevard at Denver, and there's just so much access and so much activity occurring, and that's why it feels so congested. Whereas where office parks and things like that tend to be a little more peaky and predictable. Schools are another generator that it's a very acute morning and a very short period of time in the morning and a very short period of time in the afternoon. There's some of the worst, the worst congestion when you think of, you could be stuck for a while, but then it clears pretty quickly. So, but we look at those different land uses and we kind of tie those into congestion. One thing that's interesting to think about is retail trips. That when we think on a regional basis, what really generates traffic is residential and employment. And when we do traffic modeling, those are the two big factors. Retail, while it can generate a lot of traffic acutely there, if somebody, if we put a Starbucks in next door and there was nothing there before, well, suddenly there's going to be a lot more traffic generated by that Starbucks. But those trips were probably already occurring. They were already going to a coffee shop elsewhere, a gas station elsewhere. So retail can really be acute, but also kind of moves traffic around a little bit. But when we look on a community basis, the things that are really going to generate new trips to the area are employment and housing. So when we think about congestion, how we build and how we plan has a big impact. Dense, transit-oriented developments, for instance, they generate a lot of traffic, but these are very short trips versus more of a sprawly type residential nature. So all those things kind of go into both the land use and how much traffic and congestion those land uses are going to generate.
Yeah, I'll just throw in also, it's interesting to see how trips maybe are changing since COVID. We sort of looked at trip making a certain way prior to COVID and prior to things like Amazon shipping goods and stuff like that. Things change, and as a result of things changing, trip making changes. And I think that we're seeing some different patterns now than we used to. There aren't nearly as many people getting up in the morning and going to work, and that trip making is just not happening the way that it used to. And it's just worth considering that as you think about trip making in your community.
Thank you.
Yeah, and just speaking to the different land uses, you can think about directionality, right? Like residential neighborhood, people are going to leave in a certain direction and come back in a certain direction. Same with office. But then retail, they might come in a certain direction and then exit a different direction. It might be one of many trips, whereas office and residential tends to be more of an endpoint for a longer amount of time. So just throwing that in there as well.
Yeah.
And how does this, impact the way we should think about development or some of the things that we can do to address more traffic when, as you said, good planning is involved here? What does good planning look like?
From a traffic perspective, we look at decreasing the vehicle miles traveled. It's very easy in the United States to live, and especially out west, to live 45 minutes from where you work. And that's a lot less common in some other countries that perhaps have less congestion and transit and all that ties into it. But creating uses and mixed uses and communities where people don't have to travel as far, that's simply going to help reduce congestion. And they're not, a lot of the traffic that's out on the road right now is passing through. If those trips could be shorter, it's just going to generate less congestion.
Great.
Yeah, and then combining that sort of way of organizing your land uses with the way you build infrastructure in the community. You want to make sure that and facilities, you want to make sure that you're making it possible for people to walk and bike between these land uses, to take transit between these land uses. And so it's both land use and the way you resource the community.
Yeah, well, and I think as well, you can monitor your intersections. A lot of the delays and the congestion comes from people waiting at red lights. So you can look at your timing plans and see where your volumes are on different movements and kind of project where the traffic is going to be going and what sort of capacity do you have to change those plans and how adaptive is your technology. Do you have time-based timing plans? Do you have loop-based detection? Do you have adaptive detection? How much time of day have you programmed in to your timing plans? And you can really try to optimize how many people you're putting through any given intersection or movement.
And roundabouts.
And roundabouts.
And diverging diamonds.
There's There's a lot of flexibility, yeah.
All right, great, thanks. Anybody want to chime in from the community?
I guess so.
Sure,
All right, I know you said don't get specific, but since everyone here is from the area knows
sure.
Superior well, our big challenge on the planning commission is the northwest area, or the marketplace. In the past 5 years, we've had 2 projects proposed there. One at the RTD station for like 200 or so housing units. And the marketplace owner, Bridgeport itself, had a partner project for, I think it was around 400 units. In addition to that, we've got the 7th, 6th Street properties, which could, if we go medium density residential, that could generate another couple hundred house dwelling units. So what challenges is the McCaslin Marshall interchange going to be able to handle all this? And if not, what mitigation measures should we consider, and how much might they cost?
So to reframe the question slightly more generally is maybe to ask about how mixed-use development can be created within what is currently like kind of more like suburban commercial environments without just making traffic explode. And is there strategies to be had there, or what's the thinking there?
Yeah, I think, and I think the last part of the first question was related to what types of improvements, are related to growth. And certainly developers are typically required to mitigate the traffic. Traditionally think of on a vehicular basis that, hey, if they warrant a traffic signal, they need to pay for the traffic signal. If they warrant an additional turn lane or additional lanes, they need to pay for those and help implement those. But as we build out in the community, we start to look at other methods of trying to, for a multifamily development would be having access for residents to be able to get transit passes or other ways to facilitate them biking and walking and using other modes than single occupancy vehicle. So that can be all, there are infrastructure things we talk about, but there's also policy things that developments can also contribute to. But just on a citywide planning basis, just having those programs in place so that we can mitigate the vehicular impacts of the growth.
And I think really the way that you would sort of come to your conclusion about what you would need there is through the traffic impact studies that those developments would have to generate to do that. There's a really good process for looking at new development, looking at what type of trip making is going to occur. That's the traffic impact study process. It happens every time there's a new development. And that should give you good answers to those questions that you asked.
The interchange, I'm sure you're all familiar with it, there's really not much space left in it. I know we've got in plans to add an additional lane, so we'll have 3 left turn lanes going towards Louisville. We'll have 1 straight through and 1 right. So I think I've got the number right. Alan knows better than I. So beyond that, what can we do? I have another 1,000 people in the northwest area living there. What tools might we have to try to deal with that interchange, given that we don't really have, doesn't seem like we have more space to add more lanes?
Yeah, so in urban areas where you don't have the space to add more lanes to accommodate more vehicles, what do you do? I think we touched on some things that you can do.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to add? Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Follow up to that. Your comment was about end traffic engineering, letters and things of that nature, and traffic reports that are required with new developments. But how, from a trust factor, or a understanding of what goes into those reports and those plans, when you say that it's not going to generate more traffic, 1,000 residents or 1,000 units seems like it should generate an insane amount of traffic. So how, what goes into that leads you to believe that there's not going to be a huge impact? Because what we perceive from the residential side, and then what you tell us, feel like we're not quite in not talking about the same thing, or we're off like,
Yeah.
Right.
I think the question is, Bill, why should we believe you?
Yeah. And I would say, don't believe me, believe Steve.
Perfect.
But I would say 1,000-person development is definitely going to generate some traffic.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I think you'd want to look at what the impact actually is. I mean, it's not going to be nothing, and it's not going to be horrendous
Right.
24/7. So you want to look at time of day, you want to look at directionality, you want to look at, what does 100 cars an hour actually look like on the road and in the intersections you're looking at? How much time do they need to get through? How many vehicles is that per cycle? I mean, like getting down to the actual numbers of how many more vehicles are we accommodating versus these two potential hypothetical scenarios.
And then also the combination of land uses, right? I mean, you put residential units into a commercial area to create that internal trip making. Internal trip making is an extremely important and extremely accurate consideration around potential trip making that comes out of the development. And you can really benefit from having a lot of different land uses that are just sending their trips to each other. Of course, not all trips will do that, and of course they will generate trips. The traffic impact study certainly shouldn't be saying that there's no trips, but it can be less than you might think because of all of these factors.
I once read a really great Fox Tuttle study about the types of residential uses having an impact here as far as whether some of them might be affordable housing.
Yeah.
I have a question for those of you who may have been involved in generating those studies before. It sounds like you have quite a bit. So I'm sure you have some numbers you rely on from statistics, maybe from other areas of the state, even countrywide, about, certain type of residential development, the type of traffic patterns it might generate. Do you also consider like the locality specifically? Because if I look at, say, building a bunch of residential units here in Superior versus Denver, I would expect very different outcomes because Denver has a lot more employment that can support those particular units. So I would expect a lot of those people in Denver to maybe actually be able to walk or bike to their place of employment. Whereas here in Superior, I would expect that anything that's at a market rate, most of those people are commuting to Boulder or Denver for their employment. So do you factor those local things into those types of studies?
Yeah, so the question is, where does the trip generation data come from? I think.
So we use Institute of Transportation Engineers produce a giant manual. Luckily, it's online now, it's software now. But it's decades of data about how many trips a single family house or a multifamily house or any of these land uses we could talk about, how much they generate per unit or per square foot. And the data is traditionally fairly suburban. They're actually starting to implement more, well, here's what you do if you're in a transit-oriented development. They're finally getting enough data. They want decades of data. And so we're getting more urbanized data, but we largely start with the suburban data on these types of studies. And then if we're in an urban area like Denver, we might take a reduction. And for Boulder, for instance, did some studies and found near some transit centers that they were 60% reduced from 60% of the typical suburban ITE rate for residential. So we can take reductions in some places, but we try to be conservative. But that being said, there's a lot more data coming out about affordable housing and what types, that generates a lot less traffic than a typical single family house. So we do have a lot more data that we employ now.
The question that we're answering, hi Phil, is currently is about where does trip generation data kind of come from and how do you account for local differences? I don't know if you want to jump right in and chime in on anything there or wait for the next question.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm Phil Greenwald. I'm Transportation Planning Manager with the City of Longmont. My apologies for being late. Welcome to the most embarrassing day of my professional career, I think. When it comes to, are you talking about specifically like localized? Are we talking specifically localized trip generation?
I asked the question just because I was curious. We were talking about, when some development comes in, transportation or development plan has to be made that will predict the traffic patterns that result from it. I don't probably don't have the terminology perfect here. I'm not in that industry, but and I was curious because I can imagine if something is built in Superior, it might have a very different effect compared to if it was built in Boulder or Longmont or Denver. I would imagine some places you're far more likely to be able to take a short trip on a bicycle or walking to work. Other places like Superior, where many people commute to Boulder or Denver to work, it's far less likely. So I was just curious, is that taken into account? If a residential building is built here, will we show a higher rate of traffic per unit than we would in Boulder or Denver in a report coming out of, say, the Shuttle company?
We've done traffic studies have been done all around the United States, and typically a single-family unit in Superior will generate the same amount of trips as the one in Longmont or in Boulder. But there is that other underlying piece of, how do you take that land use and then work with it as far as the transportation system underlying it? So the trip generation is typically very, very much similar. I was kind of shocked, actually, that we did a traffic study when I was working in Jefferson County, and that we had a very set neighborhood, and the trip generation was exactly at the 9.8 trips per unit that you have that was in the ITE manuals, the Institute of Traffic Engineers manuals, that those things kind of base on. So you're right. The general idea of how the land use is put together does make a difference as far as, how we take care of those trips and distribute them onto the system. But generally, it's very, very much the same. And it's kind of shockingly so, actually.
And I think maybe the distinction is that Phil's absolutely right. They generate the same number of trips, but in some communities, more of those trips are made by people walking and biking than in other communities, right? And so we would not take, for instance, in a traffic impact study in Superior, the same. We wouldn't expect the same number of people to be walking and biking as we would in Superior. We would expect more in Boulder, less in Superior.
I think that's kind of a good segue into my next question, which I'm gonna skip over one of them if you've been reading ahead in the questions, and ask about transit in small suburban communities. And in these lower density suburban areas, we don't have much of a shot at getting new fixed transit lines, according to just experience with RTD and what we can have. So is there something else that we can look to fill this gap? I think this is one of the differences that you have to account for when you're talking about the difference between living in a place like Boulder with so many transit routes and a place like Superior with one, essentially. How do we work with that? And I think I had intended this for Phil, and then whoever else wants to jump in.
Yeah, I'll just say that we've had some really great luck right now with a new idea called microtransit. And so that's the idea of a smaller van-like service. It's almost like an Uber or Lyft, but it's in a van-type configuration. So, 6 to 8 passengers, really. We've had this running since December in Longmont, and we basically cover the entire city, and we've seen some really great numbers coming out of it as far as being able to cover some of those trips that we just can't with fixed route. And so it doesn't sound like a lot, but we're getting about 200 trips per day on our van system, and it's really covering a lot of folks who can't drive or aren't able to drive. And so again, we're seeing a lot of luck in that, and that's something I'm really pushing, I think, for more suburban, exurban, where it's almost suburban to rural type configuration, or the way the land use is set up. And we're just blown away by the success that's shown in that kind of community. I think there's a lot of demand there. We're seeing a lot of people under the age of 16 being able to get to places where they weren't able to get to without a parent's help, right? And they weren't willing to take the bus, and the bus, again, kind of to Superior's point, we don't have a lot of coverage either in Longmont. And then we're seeing an older population that really doesn't want to drive anymore. They probably could drive, probably shouldn't be driving, but those two groups have really been the biggest piece of the puzzle in Longmont anyway. But it's it's that coverage and that idea of bringing a system like that into a place like this and being able to have that coverage and take people. It's also working for that first and final mile piece where you can get people out to places where you do have more robust transit. And that's been really helpful. We're trying to build more of a regional model so that, if you can work with your neighbors and put something together, that's what we're trying to do in Longmont. We're a little bit more standalone, I guess, but we are trying to bring that system to Berthoud, Erie, Firestone, Frederick, the towns around us. So we've got a similar situation.
You did compare it to ride hailing. Could you just walk us through what it's like to get a trip on one of these microtransit?
Yeah, it's basically,
shuttles?
I've got the app on my phone. You just basically, like an Uber or Lyft, you tap the app, it knows where you are, and then you just give it a destination, and it gives you a time frame, typically 5 to 20 minutes before it'll pick you up where you're at, or at a location close to where you're at. It doesn't come right to the front door like an Uber or Lyft, but it might ask you to go out to the closest roadway and pick you up there, and then it'll take you, we've seen basically within about, I think 1,000 feet is the most. So it'll take you within 1,000 feet of your home or wherever you're trying to get to, if it's more suburban. It's been great, and we charge $2 per ride now, which is kind of what we've been told is a steal. So people are saying, the first thing you probably need to do is raise the rate on that. But we started with the first month being free, and then we went to a $2 model for most people, and then $1 discount for people under 18, and then people over 65, and then people who can just state that they have a disability. So again, it's been really great. And if you're over 13 years old, you can ride without a parent technically. So it's up to the parent to kind of make that decision. But we've had some really great luck, and or more than that, we've had some really great success, I guess, is what I'd say.
So I assume in terms of cost, the city's funding this, and then so there's purchase of vans or vehicles and staff time. Maybe you could go over.
The question is, how do you fund this?
Great question. We did go through a pretty extensive effort to work with the Regional Transportation District, RTD, and we entered a partnership program, which they just started in 2023, where they actually pay some level of money to folks that have some of these ideas of how to provide transit on their own or more locally. So we did enter into the partnership program. The money first came in 2024. We were basically just able to start the service at the very end of 2024 through all those things. But we work with a vendor that is called Turnkey Service. So what they do is they do everything for you, which has been wonderful. We do spend a few hours every day just kind of monitoring. So we do have an hourly kind of, I'd say two hours a day that we spend on it. But the total costs has come to about just over $1 million per year. And that is something that the city has to work on. And I know, working with Bill over the years, they've had some great success in Boulder. Just, you do have to come to the table and bring money to the table as a locality. You can't depend on RTD. They're not going to fund this all, and they don't, unfortunately. But we did get those dollars, and then we went for some. Representative Nagoose had some dollars available too, so called congressionally designated spending dollars, and so we were able to get some dollars there too. But I'm trying to work with our group of engineers and planners to come up with that idea that we do need to maybe reallocate some resources, and we may have to not work on fixing all of our streets and making them really perfect and make them pretty good, and we can't let them deteriorate too far. But the idea is take some of those monies for streets and move them into something that is more of that transit. And if microtransit, you do share the ride with folks, so you may not be alone in that vehicle. So that's another thing we try to tell folks is it is transit, so you may be sitting with other folks and sharing rides. But again, some really good success early on.
So you brought up a great point, Phil, which is the bringing some money to the table piece. And one of the things that Boulder was successful doing was getting grant funding to start transit services, implementing those transit services, collecting lots of data and showing RTD that they would in fact be a really great route, and then getting RTD to take them over. And it may even be that you could do something like what you're describing is like the first phase. See, where are people going? Look at that data. Where are people going? And could we make a compelling case to RTD? Look at this data, a transit route that went from here to here. The data's there. The people want it. And RTD might take over that route over time.
I will say that our vendor is showing us some great data. So we are getting some great, just like you mentioned. Unfortunately, in Longmont, it's probably very similar to Superior, is there's not a lot of unique origins and destinations. Like our origins and destinations are all over the map. So we have, when we do those kind of studies, we find that we have like lines all over the place where people are trying to move. But we are starting to get some really good hotspot information. So great point. Yeah.
So that just makes me curious, where does this fit in with FlexRide? Are you all still working with the FlexRide, or have you given up on it, or does it play a role in this system as well?
Well, what's been interesting is we've used, so microtransit is an immediate on-demand service, like Uber and Lyft. And so FlexRide has turned into more of those subscription services where you can, so we're pushing people who want to do appointments. They get kind of used to this on-demand, immediate on-demand service. And then they say, well, I'd really like to be able to say tomorrow at 9 o'clock, I need a pickup to get to a 10 o'clock appointment. So we're saying, hey, use FlexRide for that. We also have Via Mobility. And so that's more for people with disabilities or people who are older in Longmont anyway. There's Via also, Mobility also provides other services in the county and outside the county that works with different populations. But we just spoke with them today and they're saying, hey, we haven't lost any service from the Via Mobility or the FlexRide service because they run both. So Via Mobility is actually saying, hey, we're seeing pretty good service that is sticking around and still working well for what we're doing. And whenever we go out and talk about the service, we really try to talk about Via Mobility as they provide a certain service for certain folks. Flex does provide a different service for different folks. And then this is really more of a kind of an immediate on-demand, can't really schedule it later kind of thing.
Makes sense, yeah.
Okay, I'll move on to the next question. This question is for Bill and Phil primarily, but anybody can jump in. It has to do with parking, and that is, how do parking requirements impact development, affordability, and travel demand?
Mind if I do?
You
All
go
right.
first, yeah.
So obviously, parking is important to development. When somebody's trying to get somewhere and they have to come by car, they expect to see a parking space there when they get it. But communities will have parking requirements, right? Developers will often be told how much parking they need to provide. And oftentimes those parking requirements are, based off of research and, information that's very old, right? Many communities have not updated their parking standards for quite some time. And consequently, developers are told to build more parking than they really need to. And you can see those developments. You can see places where there's just more parking there than what is needed for that site. And that is obviously impactful to the developer. The developer is not trying to build parking lots. They're trying to build other things. And they can't build those other things because they're spending so much space on parking. And then it has an impact for affordability because if you could actually have built a little bit less parking, you maybe could have built 10% more housing units or 10% more commercial or 10% more office. And because you didn't, what you did build is 10% or 20% more expensive to everybody who's leasing, everybody who's renting, everybody who's buying. So there's real impacts just in terms of the quality of the development and the affordability. And then I know, Longmont has been a pioneer in not having parking requirements. That is really intriguing.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. I'm a huge proponent, and I'm going to keep selling the idea that we should get rid of our parking standards. And Jeffrey really had a lot to do with that, because one of the big hurdles we had was multifamily housing. It always seemed like you would have commercial development that would provide way too much parking, but then you'd always get these housing developments that always seem to provide way too little parking. So actually, Jeffrey did a great study for the city of Longmont, and we're very proud of it, and he's won some awards for it, so that's been great too. That really showed us very clearly that only about 60% of the parking was really being used in those multifamily developments. That scared me so much. And so, a couple years ago, we just decided that we might as well take the step. Well, I should start, we did take the step about 15 years ago, almost maybe more than that, of eliminating parking minimums for commercial development, because we always said they always put way too much. And so instead of having parking minimums, we said, hey, let's put a ceiling on the number of parking spaces you can provide and not go above. So we put a parking maximum on that. We carried that into some other types of development, and finally, just last year, we decided to eliminate all parking minimums altogether, based a lot on these studies. So I'm a huge proponent now of just saying, put a cap, put a maximum level on your parking, and don't have a minimum, and don't force folks, just as Bill was mentioning, don't force people to have to build a certain number of parking spaces, because they may have a much better idea of how to use that land and maximize usually their profit, but also it also is a limited resource, that land. And so if we can better use that land, that makes a lot of difference and really helps the affordability and people being able to afford some of these places that before were covered with parking spaces. So we're excited. Yeah, we are. I guess we are the first in Colorado, which is just amazing. So, but we have a couple people that used to know or used to actually work with Don Shoup, who's kind of the pioneer for parking, and the high cost of free parking is a book that he wrote that we all kind of follow, and wondered if that would actually work or not. And I think we've been pleasantly surprised that we've really not had any problems whatsoever, and it's made our development review much easier. Mm-hmm. So just not having to calculate how many parking spaces does every development need, So thank you, Jeffrey, too, for all your help. Appreciate it.
Well, and Boulder is now following your example, and they'll be looking at some legislation this year that will remove parking minimums. And as a part of the effort that they did, they pulled together some really robust peer review across the country. So any community that wanted to look at that, Boulder would have really great current information about how that's being handled across the whole country.
So if you look at Superior and you were going to say, let's build an apartment complex not near transit, that's like down in Rock Creek somewhere, or in the Louisville, out farther, or Erie out farther. How does eliminating parking requirements or minimums address ensuring that people are able to get where they need to go?
That's a great question, and one we've. Oh, sorry.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I think the question was, if you have sort of exurban or parking that's not near, development not near transit, multifamily development, how do you ensure that there aren't going to be enough spaces for people to, park their car, which they probably need if they're going to live way out there?
That's pretty much the number one fear that we've been trying to address with folks in Longmont as well. They had the same, I mean, everybody has the same concerns. Whenever we talk about this anywhere, Boulder, Denver has been talking about it now too, and Fort Collins. So a bunch of cities are looking at this, and what we've really discovered is that in order to get a loan to build these things, the bank is going to force that hand of how many parking spaces are really necessary to make it work in these different environments. So as you get closer to transit, a bank lender may say, oh yeah, we can provide money for that with very few parking spaces because we see that you have these other things. I mean, it's like whenever you go to a bank to get any kind of money for lending, right? They want to look at the situation and see what the risk is. And so what we found out is that that's really forcing the hand of the developer of how many parking spaces they put in. A developer might come in and say, hey, I'm going to make the most money I possibly can off of this development and not provide any parking for the example you just provided. And they would get the pushback then and not probably be able to get that financing package that they need to do. But then they're also working with customers, right? So customers going to demand some of that parking too. So what we're saying is, let's put that cap on everybody so people aren't overbuilding their parking, but let supply and demand in the market kind of dictate how much parking they think they need and not have the city dictate that or a government dictate that level.
And how long ago did Longmont make that elimination?
Well, the question is the timing of when that was eliminated. And for the commercial piece, in 2014, we got rid of those parking minimums for commercial or all non-residential development. And then about 5 years ago, we put in those same kind of conditions for anything that was along our main street, where you had more of that mixed use or kind of more of that densification. We thought it's ridiculous for us in a historic downtown to tell somebody who wants to come in and build a church that you need to build all these parking spaces when we have on-street parking all around. So we took it out there, and then again, just last year is when we removed all parking minimums.
So from the commercial aspect, you have a lot of data now to say that it didn't cause any huge problems for you. The residential, it may still be to be answered. Right? Because if it was just last year that the change was made, developments that are beginning after that change was made aren't even in place yet. Right?
In Longmont, certainly, but there are other communities across the country that have been doing it for even longer. As you mentioned it, you're definitely the first in Colorado. But there certainly have been other communities out there that have done it much longer than that, and lots and lots of success stories in eliminating parking minimums.
Have you had any proposals for zero parking?
I don't think we've had proposals for zero, no. We've had some places that come in and want to utilize the parking around, and again, it's all condition-based. So we do look at each one on its own to kind of see how they fit in. But we really haven't struggled with it as much as people thought we were going to, and it's been quite nice, I guess, to see how it's just kind of worked, and it wasn't really the big deal. I think people did get scared about that. And we did kind of ease our way into it over time. So we did take steps over time to see how much we could really deal with or get used to this condition. And our problem has always been people asking for way too much parking. So there have been some conditions where people go over the cap, and we've had to really work with them and say, we've done some dealing with them as far as saying, hey, if you bring it down, or if you think that you need that much parking, just prove to us, do a parking study and show us that you need that much parking. So we will let people, if they can show us the conditions that lead to that idea of needing more parking, prove it out, but nobody's been able to really do that. So we've asked them to just stay below our standards. So that's the only issues we've run into.
Thanks. All right, down to the last question that I have for you, and that is, how can the town or, any jurisdiction help to foster multimodal connections and accessibility for all people and, all modes? And this question is directed toward Alex first, and then maybe Steve, and then whoever else wants to jump in.
So how can we do better to foster multimodal connections for all?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of approaches. I mean, we can do better at promoting transit and, kind of what you're talking about educating people on the different types of services, more consistent communication campaigns. We can advocate with RTD to change routes, to change timing, which actually has been successful. You can set up, they call them mobility hubs at transit stations and central areas, like at the park and ride here, the bike shelters, where you have a membership and you have a card to get in. You can improve your sidewalk connections, your missing connections. You can improve your trails. You can do better wayfinding signage and tell people how to get around. One idea that I've been kind of excited about lately that I want to try soon is having time alongside of distance on the wayfinding signage, because I think a mile seems far unless it's only a couple minutes on a bike. There's a lot of things that communities are doing. Carpool incentives, discounted transit fares, partnerships to promote rideshare. And then a big thing is just building and maintaining good multimodal infrastructure, whether it's multi-use paths, expanding sidewalks into multi-use paths, improving your at-grade crossings at intersections, doing mid-block crossings, doing audible buttons for ADA compliance. There's really a lot of options, and part of the challenge is just figuring out which one to do and doing it in the right places and getting people out.
Great, thanks.
I think Alex kind of gave a lot of the sort of the toolbox of things that we do to make people, make it more comfortable and more efficient to bike and walk and scooter and take transit. And I think it largely, they fall into policies, things like Vision Zero, programs that the town can do to encourage multimodal use. So there's certainly a lot of stuff at the policy level in making the corridors safer for biking and walking and other modes. And then infrastructure, which Alex talked a lot about, the things that we can do, lots of cool traffic engineering things, but just, making all those connections, sidewalk connections and multi-use path connections and, grade separated crossings are expensive, but where we can do that, Boulder's been great with the implementation of those over many, many years. And then planning, which is kind of hit on some of this earlier, where, if we, transit-oriented development, having, instead of having to drive 2 miles from your house to go to a restaurant, to be able to walk to it and being closer to those things helps with that. And then finally, engagement, engaging the ADA community and schools and make, safe routes to schools is a great program. There's, just engaging the community and trying to get these find out what people need and where they need it. I think, that's part of the process you guys are going through right now and doing a great job with it. And then how to implement it all. The grants are a big part of it. There's a lot of money out there right now. I said, talk about safe routes to schools, but CDOT, had their Main Street programs and Safe Streets for All. There's just lots of money out there that certainly, want to try to leverage as much as that as possible, because when it comes down to it, sustainable multimodal infrastructure typically is not cheap. Transit is still $1 million a year for their program. I mean, it's not cheap. And so, certainly trying to find ways to get money to implement these things is a huge part of it.
So the other thing I would throw out there is just how you prioritize the spending of your money. I remember a transportation planner once telling me communities are good at what they spend their money on. So if you spend your money on building roads, then you'll be good at having people drive cars. And if you spend your money on multimodal things, then you will teach people to be good at doing that. So that's certainly something that Boulder embraced, and Boulder invested very heavily in a multimodal community and had a tremendous amount of success in doing that. The other sort of toolbox idea that I would just throw out there is a lot of communities that are successful in multimodal have some degree of parking management as well. Not everywhere, obviously. There should be plenty of places where you can drive your car and park for free. But there can be places in your community that are such a destination, but that are also a place where maybe you're providing transit service and you're providing great bicycle facilities, and you say this is a reasonable place that people will pay to park or take the bus.
Yeah, I mean, all wonderful points, and I really do think for most, it does boil down to your policies and your people in your community and what they'd like to see and what they want, and mixing that then with the planning piece of that, and coming up with a very good land use plan that mixes well with your transportation. And understand that transportation isn't just a kind of a one-size-fits-all piece. We've really had to, we've tried to take from places like Boulder and Fort Collins and Denver and try to come up with a good system. It is very unique to the community, so the community really does have to come to the table and say, we want safer bicycling, or we want safer walking, or we want safer transit, or better, more robust transit. And so it really is the community kind of making those almost demands on their leaders to move to that next level of that. We did a great job in Longmont of building wonderful roads that carried lots of people very fast through our town, and now we're seeing that is really a detriment to the safety in our town. And you may be experiencing the same thing here, that, yeah, you've built wonderful roads that really move people quickly in cars, but we're now trying to figure out how to reallocate those resources in the roadway, in the right-of-way for the roads, back to some other modes, and give people that choice of travel. And I think it is layering all those different things. I talked about transit, how we're not going to build probably a really great fixed route bus system in Longmont by ourselves, and even with the help of RTD. It's way too expensive, and RTD's not going to put the resources there. If we want a good transit system, we're going to have to do that investment. If we want a good bike system, we're going to have to make that investment. And it's just that competition for resources. So we talk about how expensive, $1 million a year for this microtransit model. But we're looking at $30 million bridge projects, and so you start to think about how those all look kind of on a piece of paper, and where you're going to put your resources in the future. But it does take that layered approach, I think, anyway.
Tying into that question, so, we're talking about how can we get more multimodal transport, and we talk about how do communities prioritize their funding, and I imagine that some communities, throw Boulder out there, really care about multimodal transport. Some communities really may not. Do we have data from, say, the residents of Superior to say that could drive that decision in prioritizing funding, to see how these particular residents would like to spend their money, would like to travel?
The question is whether or not we have evidence that people in Superior want multimodal travel. I think for sure there is. That will come out in a lot of these plans. You'll get to see comments. It's always a little tricky because, these aren't scientifically, often the engagement is not scientific in my view. So what you have is, some people who contribute their thoughts, and, you have to base your decisions on less information than you would like. But I definitely think that we see a lot of comments about what people would like to see, and a lot of people would like to see improved facilities, multimodal facilities, and certainly, motor vehicle facilities too. Yeah, we get both.
Yeah, we definitely, it's in prioritizing projects, it's definitely a combination of public input as well as internal priorities. You know, especially with our latest round of the transportation plan update, we had dozens or maybe, I'm not sure how many, pins on a map from residents at various events, you know, would really like a better connection here, or this is working well. You know, we take all that into account when we're prioritizing projects, and some things need to be done. You know, if you have a slumped up sidewalk, you have to fix that and you have to budget for it. But then there's also some room to prioritize some of those nicer to have projects.
How do you deal with competing ideas? Like, you have a road that people want to be able to drive and not have traffic on, but then you also have people who need to cross that road to get to a school or a, you know, I don't know, a restaurant or something. So they choose to drive the, you know, half mile or quarter mile even, just because the road to cross it is difficult to cross. So how do you deal with the, like, people want both of those things, and the same person may want both of those things. They want the road when they're driving, and they want the ability to cross it when they're not driving. So, but I don't know. I don't know what my question is.
I think the question is something like, how do you deal with conflicting priorities of people, even, you know, can be even the same person in using different modes on different days for different reasons.
And I was just going to answer with that exact word. It's prioritization. Many communities, when, for instance, they build their transportation plans, right, will prioritize their modes and say, you know, for instance, everybody at one point or time is a pedestrian. Pedestrian's got to be a really important mode. And then we're going to prioritize our modes after that based on whatever our community values are. And certainly, you know, that was really clear in Boulder. If that particular scenario ever arose where kids were trying to cross the roadway and people were saying, I don't want to stop, we would be building a pedestrian crossing treatment for them. Yeah.
And, sorry, go
Well,
ahead.
I think that makes a lot of sense. You know, I'm an avid, you know, bicyclist. When I'm at home here, I commute to Boulder by car to work, but whenever I'm here, I'm trying to bicycle to the gym, to the grocery store and stuff. But at the same time, I also have to admit, I can't remember the last time I saw another person on a bicycle, right? So, you know, the community is not just for me. It's, you know, and that's why I kind of wondered, is it fair to everybody? You know, and sometimes there are louder voices in the room that have cyclists and so forth. And so I'm just wondering how we prioritize community funds.
Yeah, and I think you try to think about the greatest public good, you know, as well as taking care of the, you know, more marginalized and the folks that need it, like school children crossing the road. They're not a majority of the population, but they do need to be prioritized, and their safety needs to be important. You know, so you look at your toolbox, you consider that every change you make has pros and cons, and you try to fit the best treatments to the situation, whether it's longer crossing times or changing the timing plan, or maybe you make the median island bigger, or you partner with the school to get more crossing guards out there. I mean, I'm a big fan of objectively looking at your toolbox and trying to right size the solution.
And there might be priorities outside of transportation priorities, as I think you were suggesting a little bit there too, that you want to factor in.
I'd also just note that it's most often a political discussion, right? I mean, staff's role is largely about making informed recommendations, and your council members, their role is to set priorities and make decisions. And so in Boulder, we knew that we had the support of the community because they overwhelmingly voted in council members who would turn around and say, staff, these are our priorities. These are what you're going to do.
Yeah, and in the city of Longmont, I think the reason why Jeffrey asked me to come to this was that we just finished our transportation mobility plan this March. So we did have a council that you know, historically had been more about cars first, and this is one of the first councils, or maybe, you know, we're getting a couple years into it now, where this council really had staff look at, and we pushed a little bit from staff, but we got a lot of support then from city council in that they wanted to flip the script and put pedestrians first, bicyclists up there second-ish, transit third, freight fourth, and really single occupant vehicles at the bottom. And that was really flipping the script for us. We had always traditionally flipped it the other way around. So it is that idea of, I would say staff has had a little bit to do with that, just because we had a lot of knowledge from working with people like Bill and Steve and Alex, where we were listening to different things and saying, this is really what seems to be coming down the pike, so to speak. And we need to start thinking about this differently. So we did get buy-off from our city council that that's the way they wanted to do things. So we're going to try it out, because we don't have a lot of examples yet of how this is going to look when we actually go to the budget. So it'll be interesting to watch.
Well, we are at 7 o'clock, a little over. Thanks, everybody, for being here. This is a great panel, great discussion. Really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, so just say thanks for contributing so much. Appreciate it. It's great. It's good to be. Really, with your baby.
Thank you.
Yeah.